Hi, students of the Perusable Feast. Welcome to week 5. This week we're talking about metaphor. And as we have in each of the weeks, and as it says in the beginning of the module for this week, most of the elements that we talk about in this class, craft-wise, often feel escapable, that we may not have to always think through them fully in each piece. But as the module says, like tension, like syntax, metaphor is inescapable. And that's a good thing. Metaphor is philosophically the ways in which we come to understand what we don't know through what we do know. And so I guess what I mean by this is thinking about the ways in which in like poetry through all time has been fascinated by the moon, right? We depict the moon as a woman. We depict the moon as a silver ball, a fortune-telling element, a goddess, a spirit, a source of mystery and light and love and romance, and darkness at the same time. Even a ball of cheese, the moon is made of cheese. We have all of these formulations to understand the moon, which is something that is deeply far from us, but true to our experience every single night. And so to make that particular thing, the moon, understandable, we use the language of things we do understand, like a silver ball, like a woman's face, like cheese, to render it understandable. And so it's a profoundly moving gesture that's based entirely in language, which is really exciting. And we do this all the time, whether we realize it or not, using analogies like metaphors, similes, to get at what can't be understood through a realm of language which is understood, is really fundamental to existence. And so in the sort of like cloud of literature that we're reading in this course, and you may read later in life and have already read, we sort of academically and intellectually think about good metaphors and bad metaphors, right? I love this week in our course because the emphasis is on bad metaphors. And, often I see even on social media things like the worst metaphors my students have ever turned in. And I'm delighted by them because I think that really there is no such thing as a bad metaphor. There's only metaphors that sort of don't quite match up with their intended gesture, which can often sometimes be the most interesting ones. And so I'm always gratified in week 5 of a Perusable Feast to read your bad metaphors, because they're so brilliant. They completely are antithetical to cliche and idiom and the language that we're sort of ultra familiar with, the sort of hallmark language that ends up often feeling meaningless and vacuous and vapid. There's a kind of precision to the ways in which they fail. And so that's really exciting. I encourage you when you're doing the assignments for this week and the Yikes edition, and the So Bad It's Good, to really lean into the idea that sometimes something is so bad that it's good. I think that we could talk in this video about ways in which writers often try to avoid metaphor, the sort of like essentialism, like what it means to write in an essential manner, and the impossibility of that when metaphor is removed. I'm thinking specifically of a poem by Wallace Stevens called The Man on the Dump. I love Wallace Stevens, and that's one of my favorite poems by him. I memorized it a long time ago and would say it in my head as I was walking up and down the street. But he specifically talks about the moon in that poem, jumping back to the idea of the moon. And he says in this poem, the sort of the emphasis, the desire is to lay all the images of the world on the dump. And we find by the end of the poem that perhaps the dump is the most interesting place one can be, because it has all the refuse of language that we have sought to discard. But in the poem, he says, near the end, when its speaker is trying to fully divorce themselves from metaphor, he says, He says, you see the moon not as an image of the moon, but the moon itself. You see the moon rise in the empty sky. And the kind of inherent sadness of that emptiness, right? Like to what extent can the moon be beautiful if it's in the empty sky? It's profoundly alone and alienated, and we have no sort of connotational realm to compare it to anything. Comparison is the sort of bonding agent of understanding and intrigue and desire. So yeah, I think that just to give you the sort of indication of Stevens as a modernist poet who was writing, nearly a century ago, the idea that removing oneself from metaphor is an ethical implication, that we should see things as they are, not as what they relate to. An interesting idea. We have the imagists, who see things only as images that don't have sort of connotations beyond them. But in this class, we're embracing metaphor. And the reason we're doing this is so that once you fully understand and grasp how to craft metaphor, whether they be good, quote unquote, or bad, quote unquote, you can decide for yourself to what extent they're useful in your writing, whether it be poetry or prose or some sort of hybrid between those two. And I think it can be quite difficult to separate the notion of metaphor from image, because often descriptions that use comparative impulses that aren't distinctly metaphors do sort of hover in that metaphorical cloud. So whether or not you think you're writing metaphor, if you think you're not, you may still be in some sort of obtuse way. So I guess what I'm saying, all of this to say, if you find yourself inclined towards essentialism, clarity, precision outside of connotative language, use this as your opportunity to do something different, to occupy that realm of comparison and lushness and seeing the world associatively in your writing. Association in writing is super useful because it can sort of track the movement of the mind in ways that actually mimic thought, that mimic perception in a way that a sort of linear narrative language often doesn't. So go with those associations that are sort of like first thought, best thought, as I think Pound said, Ezra Pound might have said that, or William Carlos Williams, one of those guys. First thought, best thought is the implication here in the metaphor, the bad metaphor exercise. And in terms of like metaphors that sort of stand the test of time, there are good ones and then there are bad ones that are memorable, both equally memorable in literature. And so I would encourage you, as you're reading the pieces this week, look into the Annie Dillard piece. Annie Dillard is a really, really excellent writer, specifically of nonfiction. She has a piece about the eclipse that I often teach, but her sort of more craft-based writing for this week is super useful and excellent as well. I think that's it in terms of metaphor. We've explored all the implications of essentialism and lushness and images that don't quite match up, and how those might be productive and compelling and urgent and provide texture to your writing. I have so much more to say about what we consider good writing and bad writing, and I've sort of fed you those little breadcrumbs as we go along. But as I always say, go boldly into your pieces for this week. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. There are no mistakes to be made, and especially in this week where we're doing the Yikes edition, embrace the moments of disruption, the moments of slippage, things that may seem careless or imprecise. That's what we're here for, to sort of explore the possibilities of what our language might do, whether that be poetry or prose. I've graded all the pieces for last week in syntax. They're all really excellent. Your discussion posts were really thorough as well. If you need anything from me before my next video, absolutely reach out. I'm here for you. And as this course draws closer and closer to an end, if you would like to have a Zoom meeting or send me a larger excerpt of your work, have any questions about any of the specific weeks that we've gone through, many of you have reached out already, and I'm doing my best to sort of provide thorough feedback and external readings and things like that. If you're applying to future programs, let me know. I may be able to offer you some kind of wisdom or guidance, or if you need a letter of recommendation, what have you. Yeah, that's my job. That's what I'm here for, and I love to do it. So I hope you have a great week, and happy writing. Bye.